thinks we got above a 200 bushel corn crop on their farm this year? Got a few hands? Yeah, got a few. Who thinks above 180? Okay, yeah, we're pretty good. Who's under 180 in this room? Okay, there's a few, not as many. The rest of them are all in Eastern Ontario. That's the story of the year, right? We get east of Toronto and it gets a lot tougher. Who thinks they got 50 plus on beans? Okay, under 50. Yeah, okay, so a little bit of a split. Seems gonna be, we're gonna maybe we got it right, who knows? The story of the tour though, I mean, we'll flip through some slides and woohoo, that's great. But the story of the tour was, how do you measure a field that is amazing in one part and horrendous in another? We were in Eastern Ontario and we did a field, same hybrid all around. 212 one spot, drove down the laneway on the way to the next field, and I went, uh-oh, that part of the field is legitimately zero. There's no ears there, there's no tassels there, there's no corn there. So that's the story. So the hope is our awesome scouts scouted enough fields this year that we got a good average, because that's all we could hope for. And I think the way we do the tour, hopefully that got us really close. So big shout out to our sponsors. So thanks for everyone, making the tour possible. We really appreciate that. If you see a sponsor in the room, make sure you thank them too, because we couldn't do it without them. But who likes these pictures? We got a few guys in the room that have farms like this actually as well. There's Norfolk County. Those ears on the bottom there, they were blank basically. There was no harvestable kernels. And the ones that we were pretty sure were just going to go right through the combine head. The deck plates wouldn't even get them. And then in mountain, it was a first for me. I've never really walked a 0 bushel cornfield, but out of 17 and a half feet, we only had 4 ears with kernels on it. So we did the math. We didn't even app it because there really was no way to app it. I figured it was 1.9 bushel corn. So he was already talking with crop insurance, hey, can we just mow this down and move on? Because we're not going to run $100 an acre combine through that field for what reason, right? So we'll see where that goes. But you guys are blessed in this room, most of you, not all of you, but most of you had a pretty good season compared to this. Pods, they're not very plump. We don't have a lot of pods. You can see the numbers there, right? We're doing 7 pods. What's that, about 20%? So that kind of tells you the story. What are we going to be off of last year's numbers? Well, something like that. The other story is, I'm kind of concerned the beans are not very big in the pods, right? We do need rain in August, and we haven't got much rain in August in the majority of Ontario. Some areas have, some areas haven't. But that's one of the stories to watch on beans. Peterborough, who's heard about Central? That's a story, right? 13.1 bushel per acre beans. That's not really going to pay the bills. The other big story was, you heard Sean talk about attrition in beans. Every year on tour, how we measure plants, harvestable plants is up for debate, but we always end up around 140,000. Well, this year we were around 130,000. So that tough start, that ugly May we had, we did get lower stands, and it's showing up in fields. We did have some fields, sub 100,000 that they're on ground that needs much more than 100,000 plants. So that story played through in soybeans for sure. There wasn't a lot of big beans. There wasn't a lot of 70 bushel beans out there. There was areas. The Southwest was good. Along the Lake Huron was pretty good. And, we were lacking, 4 bean pods. Eastern Ontario still had some pretty good beans in pockets, but the real story was just how hit and miss it was, miles apart from different areas. The thunderstorms are the big story, right? This was an interesting pro-tillage tour, but, Peter, it is a sample, right? But full tillage, he did have some compaction. In all fairness, this is from Eastern Ontario, but the full tillage did count a lot better. There was a lot less tip back. You could tell the plants were bigger. That farm was in pretty tough, but this farm was only 10 minutes away from the farm that we counted at 0 in Eastern Ontario. So pretty cool photo actually, and you know, those two photos are within 100 feet of each other in fields across the lane, same tillage practice, same farm, so same plant date. So pretty interesting. The other thing I noticed was, you know, we talked about kernel weight, but the kernels on the strip tillage, same hybrid, looked like they were a little bit bigger. I guess we'll see what the yield comes out to. That was the story in the east, right? The ears are short. Look at, you know, tons of tip back. We also ended up into, you can see the 1 year, there's some bad pollination. We had some bad buds, some missing kernels. It was too hot at night during pollination. You know, for a bit I thought we were going to get away with most of it, but I do think the canopy was hotter at night than the nighttime temperatures. We were keeping the heat in the canopy, and hot nighttime temperatures really hurt pollination, and they speed us through grain development. So we're probably going to end up with a little smaller kernels than we'd like. So just some more negative effects on the corn crop. And you know, Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry, those are pretty good counties. That's pretty tough looking corn in eastern Ontario. We're definitely off on length, but that should be expected, I guess, with the drought, right? Lower plant count. I told Mo, he called me this spring and he said, how's the crop? I said, looks fine. Plant stand's horrendous. That was the story. 29.2, we're a full 2,000 plants off of last year's high, maybe even a little bit less. But right off the bat, we didn't have the plants we needed to maximize yield in Ontario, right? That's a pretty low stand. Who thought May was a wonderful month? I didn't. What was it, coldest May in 40 years or something? Ridiculous amount of rain right in the middle of planting, and the stands show that, right? We had tons of plants too that had non-harvestable ears, runts. Plants were that affected from that cold shock, poor emergence. And it was really reflected in that number, right? Last year we were right around 31,000, so disappointing stand counts. You know, here was some irrigated corn. You know, these are still big numbers, 260, right? But we've had 280s, 290s. I think we had a 296 a couple years ago, counted on tour. You know, keep in mind when we count, we use a set divisor on kernel weight. We don't really adjust depending on hybrid. But this year, these were some of the highest counts. So we didn't see any massive yield counts this year, where in the past we've had some pretty big numbers come out of those farms. Here's that good pollination stress. We got big tip back on the one, spotty kernel set on the other. There was too much heat. There was too little moisture for a lot of farms across Ontario, and we saw it pretty much everywhere we went. There's those 4 ears out of, you know, 34 plants in Ottawa. You know, those are pretty nice. There's some more tip back, 92 bushel corn in Ottawa. That was really interesting. From the road, what a wicked looking field of corn. It was pretty much green top to bottom. Great looking plants. Pulled the ears back, and in the middle there was almost no ear on them. You know, less than, they're probably 50 bushel ears in spots in the field, even though the plants were green top to bottom. So make sure you get out, walk your fields and take a look. But, you know, the bright side, you see some on here. Here's some nice ears. Chad and Kent Lambton. Hey, Lambton got a good turn in the sun. They got really good yields in Lambton this year. So, you know, some of Ontario is lucked out this year. Some of them were in bad luck last year, too much water. They've been a lot better this year. So, Quebec. This is, you know, for the big picture, the story, you know, basis when Mo talks. Quebec is also way too dry. That's not a great story. They were wet start, and now they went dry. That's about the worst combination you can get. So this was from the Quebec crop tour. We don't do this, but they did this in Quebec, and they're pretty disappointed in yields as well. There's some pictures, similar story to what we're seeing, right? Poor ear development, you know, poor kernel set, the whole story. And there was their yield right below the 10-year average on both corn and soybeans. So Quebec isn't going to exactly save the day for Ontario either, in eastern Ontario when it comes to grain. So the biggest story, you know, when we start seeing these numbers will be, there's your drought map. So where does that start? you know, pretty much kind of where we are is where we get into abnormally dry, and then we go east of us, that's where we're into moderate drought. So that's the story. And then the reality is there's pockets within those areas that are even worse than the averages. So here we go, the big numbers. 178.9 on corn, below the 10-year average. 186 is the 10-year average on Agricor. Beans were coming in at 46.61, again below the 10-year average of 48 bushels on Agricor. So pretty disappointing numbers, I guess, from that perspective after a couple years. Well, last year I think Agricor came in at a 204, 203 the year previously, back-to-back 53 bushel bean crops. You know, we're way off the mark this season. So the story is there is a lot of bad crop in Ontario, but when it comes to production, the production in the Southwest is saving all of Ontario. About a third of the corn production is in the Southwest, and you can see we gave the Southwest a 200. Western or Central or whatever you want to call, you know, the rest of Ontario, not the Southeast, 180, so average corn, right, respectable. 42 bushel beans. Beans weren't great up there. We don't have much faith without rain in August, how those are going to turn out. Then we look at the Southeast, 166, but Oxford is keeping that weight up. Oxford's included in the Southeast. So Oxford, we call just sub 200 on corn, not far off, but that's really helping the rest of those counties that are weak. We go to the east, you've heard how bad Central is, 130 on corn, 30 bushel beans. There were some counties sub 30 bushel beans, and we had we had one county, I put Hastings at 100 bushels flat on corn, so pretty tough on corn. Eastern Ontario called it a 171 and 46. So definitely a disappointing year east of here for sure. There's a breakdown by counties. I'm sure that'll be available on the web, and we'll have these handouts available eventually as well. So that gives you every county. Keep in mind we do our best on counties, but the big number is what our goal is because we need the average to get out. But we do have set targets based on how many acres of each crop are in each county. There's the Southwest. You can see Elgin's having a really good year. We call it 61 bushel beans. I counted a lot of good beans in Elgin when I was there. They had a tough year last year, way too much water. You know, again, keep in mind it isn't what we saw in the field. It's not perfect. But you can see the big difference between the Southwest and when we go to the Southeast. You know, we're definitely off the mark in Niagara, Haldeman, Norfolk, Brant, and Hamilton, Wentworth. You know, Western Ontario, pretty average corn yields. Beans were maybe a little disappointing as our thought. Definitely off on pod count. Central Ontario is just a disaster, to be honest. There's not much else to say. They needed rain. They've had less than an inch of rain in areas. They did pick up a rain recently, but too little, too late, right? And then Eastern Ontario, again, we're hoping the good counties with deep soil kind of pull their weight. They have more acres, but there is some pretty sad crops there as well. So there's your 25 versus 24. Some pretty big swings. Haldeman, Norfolk, minus 53. Niagara, minus 56. Oxford, minus 14, not a huge hit. Hamilton, Wentworth, minus 42. So that Southeast took a big hit. You know, Wellington, Huron, Ottawa, SDNG. Some really big hits there, right? Chatham-Kent, we had plus 11. But long story short, Chatham-Kent looked really good. They didn't have too much water. They had the right amount of water. Beans, Elgin's up big. Everyone else is up big down, right? SDNG down 17. Had some really big numbers there last year. Pretty ugly numbers this year. You know, it is what it is. They're not great. So, this is the story, right? Eastern Ontario, 25 versus 30-year average, down 48% on rainfall. GDDs were a bit above normal. Woodstock, 32% below normal. Chatham, 7% below normal. You guys just always win down in the Southwest. Then Central, 33% below normal. Keep in mind that station we're pulling picked up 71 mils last week. So that makes a big difference, right? So we're talking about a quarter of the rainfall came in the last week there. So before that, since July 1st, a lot of those sites had only had about 1 to 2 inches. And then Niagara, we're down 21% of normal. GDBs, again, we've caught up, but some areas, we were pretty close to normal. So, the last I want to say, hey, the scouts, thanks for all your hard work. The team that's here, we couldn't do the tour without you. The counts are what makes the tour. I could not come up with a number. Mo could not come up with a number without you guys. So thanks for all your guys' hard work. We really appreciate it. Thanks to you guys farmers for letting us on your fields.